A second way that we can look at the church is from an organizational type. Organizational types deal with how the church functions, its approach to leadership, its perception of ministry, and the decision-making process. Now, as we think about the small church being a family, and using that kind of as a model for us, if you would, there's several ways that the church functions organizationally. First of all, there's what we call the traditional family church. As we think about a traditional family, that's where the husband and the wife and the children follow very traditional roles handed down by the previous generation. A patriarch or matriarch has greatly influences the decision. The extended family is important because of the bloodlines. Well, that's true in the small church. That a traditional family is a church that has very strong traditional roles. That although they look to the pastor for spiritual leadership, there also is, from the organizational standpoint, the patriarch or matriarch who is the one who has significant influence in the church. And in this church, tradition plays an important role because it ties the generations together. This is a church that's hard to get into at times, but it's also hard to get out of. That once you're in this church, they don't let you leave because of the relational connections to the church. Now, as we think about the traditional family, certainly this is where we find the tribal chief most predominant. But the tribal chief, the power broker, is the individual who has the most influence. Now, as pastors, it's important that we work with them. And how do we do that? How do we work with pastors? Well, let me suggest to you several principles in terms of working with the tribal chiefs. First of all, we need to recognize the importance that they play within the life of the church. And we need to utilize their wisdom, their knowledge. That as we come into the ministry, as we identify them, they can be our greatest asset for helping us to understand the culture, because they're the ones who are the cultural pillars of the church. They're the ones who understand the culture the best. And we can utilize that wisdom to effectively understand the culture. Secondly, we need to gain their support for programs and propose changes before they're implemented. See, if we can have them buy into what we want to do or what we need the changes that we need to make, then it will be very easy for us to implement that within the whole congregation. Why? Because they agreed to it. It must be good. So we need to work with them, and they need to be the ones that we talk to and bounce things off of and get them on board and share with them why we're doing what we're doing. So we want to gain their support. Thirdly, we want to communicate with them so that they can help communicate needs and issues and vision to the congregation. Spend a lot of time with them over a cup of coffee, sharing with what you want to see happening, why you want it to see happening. Communicate with them. Fourthly, disciple them in order that they might use their influence for the good of the church rather than their own agenda. As you think about the power brokers in the church, those are the people you want to make sure are spiritually mature. And sometimes we go into a church and they're not. Sometimes they're very spiritually immature. Well, there needs to be the ones we disciple. Rather than try to fight them, let's sit down and start discipling them, to bring them up to maturity so that they can have a positive impact upon the spiritual growth of others. Fifth, we need to make sure that we minister to them by developing their spirituality and leadership abilities. And then lastly, and this is the one that's perhaps the most difficult in this church, is we need to make sure that they give others the opportunity to voice their ideas and opinions. While they will be influential, they should never be allowed to be intimidating in the church. And sometimes we do have to confront them on this, if necessary. But again, we need to do so very cautiously, very prayerfully, that we're going and seeking to encourage them and strengthen them. That's the traditional church. And again, we're going to find that in the very rural settings, especially. Then there's the blended family. Because the blended family has different people from different backgrounds coming together, there's a lot of different dynamics there. While they demonstrate some of the characteristics of the church, the traditional church, there's also a newness to them. There's different ideas because you have individuals coming from different backgrounds. Sometimes that creates tensions in the church. But as they come together, they face them. Then we have the cosmopolitan family. This is the church that's very progressive. This is a church that's very open to new ideas. They're not traditionally driven. They're always looking for new ideas. This is the church that oftentimes is found in a very urban context where there's just a lot of influx of people. Now here's where the pastor is called upon to be the visionary. They look to the pastor to be the trendsetter in the church. And then lastly, there's the ethnic family. This is the church that is significantly influenced because of its ethnic background. Now, as we look at the churches, and we look at these four different types, how they view leadership and how they view different aspects of the church differ. For example, as we think about the traditional family church, the pastor they view as more of an instructor. He's more of a chaplain. He's there to take care of and be the shepherd spiritually to the people. Whereas in the blended family, the pastor is viewed as more of a guide, a person who assists the church in setting goals, but has more of a dynamic influence. In the cosmopolitan family, the pastor is the visionary. He is the leader. He is regarded as the tribal chief by the church. Now, in the ethnic family, the role of the pastor is determined more by the ethnic background. For example, a church, a Russian church will give a lot more authority to the pastor than would an American church, simply because of the culture and how they view leadership and how they view people in positions of leadership. In the traditional family, the leadership is determined by family relationships and past heritage. They earn the right. That's because they got family connections. In the blended family, leadership is determined by the present involvement. What are they currently doing? What are they doing, and how are they effective they are? In the cosmopolitan family, leadership is determined by their vision and how much they can communicate that vision and their ability to set goals. In the traditional family, the plans and direction of the church are determined by the tribal chiefs in the congregation, whereas in the blended family, it's determined by the pastor in the congregation, whereas in cosmopolitan, it's determined by the pastor and the board. In the traditional family, the focus is upon, in terms of the people, the focus is upon past traditions which tie the present generation to them with the previous in the traditional family. In the blended, it's past traditions and present situation, whereas the cosmopolitan, their focus is in the future. What are the trends, and how does that translate to where the church will be 10 years from now? The worship styles differ. The traditional family has a very traditional style of worship. The blended family has a mixture, but nothing that pushes the limits. The two churches, I mentioned the two churches that I was pastoring. The one was a very traditional church. The other was a blended family church. The one we sang hymns. The others we sang hymns and choruses. Whereas in the cosmopolitan church, The worship style would be very contemporary. That's where you'd find the worship teams, the worship band. And so they differ in terms of their style, and it's important that how we understand and relate to that style in their worship. Their programs are going to differ. In the traditional family, it's more inward focused upon the congregation, whereas in the blended, it's inward with some outward, and the Cosmopolitan tend to be very outward. They're very progressive. Evangelism in the traditional is, I want to evangelize my family and friends, the people I know, the people I have a relationship with. In the blended family, it's a family, friends, and neighbors. So it's a little broader in their focus. In the Cosmopolitan, it's more of the unknown masses. They have a very outward focus of ministry. Membership in the traditional family is exclusive. It's hard to get into, and it's harder to get out of. I always say that the small traditional family church has a very small front door, but it does not have any back door. Once you're there, it's very hard to get out of. They will keep you there because of that family connection. The blended church has more of a restrictive type of membership. You can be a part, not to the level or not to the restrictions of the traditional, but still there's some of them there. Whereas the Cosmopolitan is very inclusive. Everybody's welcome. And again, in the ethnic, it's determined by the ethnicity of the group. Decision-making process in the traditional is made before the meetings, whereas in the Cosmopolitan, it's made by the representative few and then ratified by the congregation. Each has their strengths, each has their weaknesses. As we look at these different models, it's important for us to understand that there's not necessarily one that's necessarily right. All of them have strengths, all of them have weaknesses. But as we go into the church, we need to understand, how do they think? How do they view their culture? So that we can begin to effectively minister within them, that in areas that there's weakness that we need to deal with and we need to strengthen, we can deal with them. But we can also then take and utilize their strengths to advance the gospel. For example, how do you motivate a traditional family in evangelism? How do you get people evangelistic? You don't do it by getting up and saying, we need to reach the world with the gospel of Christ. We say we need to reach our friends and our family with the gospel of Christ. And you begin to challenge them to do that. And then as they start doing that, you can begin to broaden their perspective to reach the world. But you start with where their relationship's at. So it's important for us to understand the culture of the church. That if we're to be effective in ministry, we have to understand how they think so that we can adapt our ministry to that and begin to minister within that context to strengthen the church towards church health.